Okay, so are you ready to dive deep? Because today we're looking at something pretty weird, an organization called Training in Power.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a real mix of sources. We've got testimonials from ex-members, academic research, even a snippet of the leader herself speaking.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
It is fascinating because, on the surface, Training in Power seems like a typical self-improvement group,
Yeah.
but then you start digging a little deeper and,
Yeah,
well, let's just say there are questions that need answering.
absolutely. So first things first, what exactly is Training in Power?
Well, it was founded way back in 1986 by this woman, Faye Fitzgerald,
Okay.
and it's all about, so they say, meditation and healing, helping people reach their full potential.
Right.
Sounds pretty standard for a self-improvement
And
group,
I've seen tons of groups like that.
right?
But I have a feeling there's more to this story.
You got that right.
Yeah.
There's a whole Reddit community dedicated to talking about whether Training in Power is a cult. And get this, there's a podcast called Cult Vault that did a whole episode on it.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Okay. Yeah, that definitely piques my interest. And this is where your expertise comes in. To help us unpack all of this, we're going to use what's called the BITE model. Can you break that down for our listeners?
Absolutely. The BITE model was developed by Stephen Hassan, who's a leading expert on cults. And it stands for Behavior, Information, Thought, and Emotional Control.
Okay.
And it's essentially a framework for assessing how much control a group has over its members.
So we're going to use this BITE model like a lens to examine training and power.
Precisely. We'll take what we know about Training in Power and compare it to some of the warning signs Hassan outlines in his work, particularly his book, Freedom of Mind. And it should help us connect the dots and hopefully shed some light on what's really going on here.
All right, let's do it. What are some of the red flags from the BITE model that seem most relevant to training and power?
Let's start with behavior control. One thing that often pops up in cults is regulating where members live, how they manage their money, even making major life decisions for them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That level of control over someone's daily life is a huge warning sign.
Yeah, that makes sense. Losing control over your own life doesn't sound very healthy. What about information control?
That's another big one. Think about things like limiting access to outside information,
Okay.
heavy reliance on internal propaganda, basically anything that prevents members from getting a balanced perspective.
So, like, if Training and Power bombarded members with, Faye Fitzgerald's teachings, but discouraged them from, like, reading anything critical of her or the group.
Exactly.
Right.
And we actually see evidence of this in some of the ex-member testimonials we have.
Uh-huh.
Several people mentioned being pressured to read Fitzgerald's books, attend her lectures, while being actively discouraged from seeking outside information.
Wow, that's pretty controlling. Okay, what about thought control? What does that look like in practice?
Think thought-stopping techniques, forbidding critical questions about the group's teachings or the leader. Anything designed to stifle independent thinking.
So, like, if Training and Power had specific practices designed to shut down any doubts or criticism.
Right.
Gotcha.
And it's interesting. One ex-member described a practice where they were told to snap a rubber band on their wrist every time they had a negative thought about Faye Fitzgerald.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's intense. It sounds almost like they're trying to reprogram people's thoughts.
that's a good way to put it.
Oh,
And then we have emotional control, which can be one of the most insidious forms of manipulation.
yeah, this one feels particularly tricky.
It is. We're talking about groups that use guilt and fear to keep members in line, especially fear of leaving the group.
So it's not just about controlling their actions and thoughts, but their feelings, too.
Exactly.
Hmm?
And one way to create this emotional dependence is through a tactic called love bombing.
Love bomb it.
Yeah. The group showers new members with affection and approval, making them feel like they finally belong. But this is often followed by harsh criticism if they step out of line,
Oh, wow.
creating this constant cycle of emotional highs and lows.
That makes a lot of sense. And that kind of manipulation can have a lasting impact even after someone leaves the group.
Absolutely. Dr. Janja Lalich, who is an international authority on cults, extremism, and coercion, emphasizes that rebuilding one's identity and sense of self after leaving a controlling group can be a very challenging journey.
Okay, so we have this framework, the BITE model, and we're already seeing some potential red flags popping up with Training in Power. But to really get a sense of who Faye Fitzgerald is, let's hear her speak for ourselves. This clip comes from a video called Revelations.
Oh, this should be very illuminating.
Let's listen in.
I'm the one who collected you all and brought you in. I'm the leader of the second wave. Some people can't find their family coming in because their family all came. We didn't just come in as troops. We came in with families and fanfare. We came in together. We were in love. We loved each other. We were wonderful. We were free agents, and we never lost touch, and we were immortals, and we were visit each other anytime, really, through thought.
Yeah, the first thing that struck me was her tone. It's very authoritative, almost grandiose, and the way she uses language is interesting too. It's very us versus them, like creating a clear divide between her followers and the rest of the world.
And her claims about being an archangel sent to Earth, leading a second wave, it all sounds so otherworldly.
Exactly. And this is something we see quite often with cult leaders. They create this elaborate origin story that elevated them to like a special, almost superhuman status. It adds a layer of mystique and makes their pronouncements seem unquestionable.
It's like she's building a whole different reality, a narrative where her followers are the chosen few.
Right. And that ties back to the BITE model, specifically thought control. By introducing this new map of reality, cult leaders can manipulate their followers' perception of the world, making them more dependent on the group for information and guidance. It's a very powerful form of control.
Hearing Faye Fitzgerald's words is chilling. But to understand the real-world impact, let's turn to the experiences of those who left Training in Power. We have some quotes from ex-members on the Lessons in Awareness website. What are some of the things that stood out to you?
There are so many powerful stories, but one theme that emerges again and again is this sense of betrayal. Many people joined Training in Power with genuine intentions, seeking personal growth and healing. They had no idea what they were getting into.
One ex-member described it as a bait and switch. They said, when you first join, it's all about self-development. You're learning to meditate, heal, and grow, but then it shifts to something else entirely.
And that shift can be very subtle. It might start with little things like being encouraged to spend more time with the group or prioritize Faye Fitzgerald's teachings over everything else. But gradually that control tightens, and people find themselves increasingly isolated from their friends, family, and their former lives.
Another ex-member wrote about how difficult it was to return to a normal life after leaving Training in Power. They talked about struggling to make decisions, to trust their own judgment, even to connect with people outside the group. That suggests a really powerful, lasting impact.
Absolutely, and this is where the emotional control aspect comes into play. When a group becomes your entire world, your whole identity is wrapped up in it. Leaving can feel like losing a part of yourself. It's incredibly disorienting.
One quote that really hit me hard was from an ex-member who talked about the fear of leaving. They said, "I was terrified of what would happen to me if I left. They made it clear that the outside world was dangerous and that only Faye Fitzgerald could protect us."
That's a classic cult tactic, instilling fear and paranoia to keep members from questioning or leaving. It's a very effective way to maintain control.
We also have a quote from an ex-member who talked about the financial control they experienced. They were pressured to donate a large portion of their income to the group and eventually had to declare bankruptcy. That's devastating.
Financial exploitation is unfortunately very common in cults. Leaders often use their position of power to enrich themselves at the expense of their followers.
Okay, we've looked at the BITE model, we've heard Faye Fitzgerald's own words, and we've heard from people who were actually in Training in Power. Based on all this, what are your thoughts? Does Training in Power fit the definition of a cult?
Well, that's a complex question. And to be fair, there's no official cult checklist that everyone agrees on. But based on what we've seen today, there's certainly some very concerning characteristics that align with common cult patterns.
So it's not a black and white answer, but there's enough evidence to warrant serious concern.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key takeaway for our listener. It's not about labeling any specific group as a cult or not. What matters is that we develop the critical thinking skills to recognize these patterns of control and manipulation wherever they may appear.
So even if Training in Power isn't officially classified as a cult,
It certainly exhibits many of the hallmark signs, and that's reason enough to be cautious.
this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. It makes you realize that these things can happen anywhere, even in groups that seem harmless on the surface.
That's why it's so important to be informed and to know the warning signs. We all want to find community, purpose, and personal growth. But it's crucial to do so in a way that doesn't compromise our autonomy or well-being.
Okay, so what are some red flags that our listeners should be aware of, things that might indicate a group is using undue influence or control?
Well, first and foremost, trust your gut. If something feels off, if a group seems too good to be true or demands unquestioning loyalty, those are big red flags.
What about more specific things to watch out for?
Pay attention to how the group treats dissent. Are questions encouraged, or are they met with hostility? Does the group have a strong us versus them mentality, demonizing outsiders or critics? Those are things to be wary of.
It's also important to consider the group's leadership. Are the leaders accountable, or do they operate with absolute authority? Do they encourage independent thinking, or do they demand blind obedience?
Those are excellent points. And it's important to remember that anyone can be vulnerable to these tactics regardless of their intelligence or background. Cults often target people who are going through a difficult time in their lives, seeking belonging or a sense of purpose.
So even if training in power isn't a full-blown cult,
It certainly exhibits some concerning characteristics that warrant further scrutiny.
we've gone from a seemingly innocuous meditation group to some pretty eyebrow-raising stuff. I have to say, this deep dive has really opened my eyes.
It's a reminder that critical thinking is more important now than ever. We're bombarded with information from all sides, and it can be tough to discern what's genuine and what's manipulative.
And this isn't just about cults, right? These same warning signs can apply to all sorts of groups and relationships.
Exactly. We see these patterns in toxic workplaces, abusive relationships, even online communities that promote extremist ideologies. The BITE model can be a valuable tool for assessing any situation where you feel your autonomy or sense of self is being compromised.
So on that note, I think it's time for our final thought-provoking question for our listener. We all want to improve ourselves, to find a sense of belonging and purpose, but at what cost? How can you ensure that your desire for growth doesn't lead you down a path of undue influence?
That's the million-dollar question. I would say trust your gut. If something feels off, if a group seems too good to be true or demands unquestioning loyalty, take a step back.
Yeah.
Talk to people outside the group, do your own research, and remember that you always have the right to say no.
And maybe give that Cult Vault podcast a listen. Just saying.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. Until next time, deep divers, stay curious, stay critical, and stay informed.
Yeah, it is kind of scary that something that starts out as this quest for self-improvement could lead someone down such a dark path.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to talk about these things because, cults and other manipulative groups thrive in the shadows. So the more we talk about these issues, the more we shine a light on them, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and others.
You've given our listener a lot to think about. What's one final provocative thought you'd like to leave them with?
I would say think about all the groups and communities you're part of. Are they helping you grow, helping you be more independent? Or are they kind of chipping away at your independence? It's a question we should ask ourselves often.
Yeah, it is so easy to get caught up in the excitement of belonging.
Yeah.
Especially if a group is promising something you want so bad, transformation or enlightenment or even just community.
Right. And that's why it's so important to think critically. Don't be afraid to question, to challenge, to seek outside perspectives. Your well-being might depend on it.
Well said. Great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course, it was my pleasure.
And remember, stay curious, stay critical, and stay informed.